The point I want to make on this slide is that although I don't practice as a med doctor, I have to be informed of the position of the HPCSA and what is my responsibilities, both as a scientist and as a medical person with a medical training. And I want to draw your attention to point 27AD, because I believe that this is what's driven my life, that 27AD is what drives me in all that I do in science. Your job is to provide adequate information about the patient's diagnosis, treatment options and alternatives, costs associated with each such alternative, and any other pertinent information to enable the patient to exercise a choice in terms of treatment and informed decision-making pertaining to his or her health and that of others. So my argument is that I have a unique experience in understanding nutrition, and it is my job to make the South African public and anyone in that public aware that we don't have the final answers. There is a lot of other information out there. And so I don't believe it's appropriate that I should be constrained in what I do if I'm trying to provide information that allows clients, patients, the general public to know more about their condition and their treatment options. And that's, as I indicate, is what has driven me. And so the ethical responsibility of doctors and nutritionists is to offer all the therapeutic options, not a confined group of options that they find convenient. And I would argue that if you find that you can't agree with the options that are given because that's convention, you still have the ethical responsibility to provide all the information that you have and how you interpret it. So my view is that I act within the ethical constraints of the HPCSA when I encourage people to think beyond what is the conventional. And I've spent the last 4 days or 5 days providing the evidence to support my position that the conventional is not correct. And it's my responsibility with my unique insight to do whatever I have to make sure that that message gets out. That is my ethical responsibility. And I would be failing in my ethical responsibility if I did not do that. If I had a special training, a special knowledge, a special insight, and I kept it hidden, knowing as I do or believing as I do that the advice we're giving is incomplete and incorrect and harmful. So that is my belief of what my ethical responsibilities are. And the HPCSA has two jobs. It has to protect the public, but it also has to guide the profession. And I believe they failed me because they had no guidelines on how you should be using social media. And it's very difficult for me to understand how must I know what I should be doing on social media if the HPCSA has not drawn up any guidelines to advise me and to show me where I was doing what was wrong. I'm such a profoundly ethical person. I would not do anything that would harm anyone. If I honestly knew what I was doing was wrong, there is no way I would do it. And not for 1 minute did I think that I was doing something that was unethical. And to come now and charge me on the basis of an absence of guidelines is inconceivable to me. My career has been characterized by taking on a number of ideas that I found to be unacceptable and wrong. And it was my responsibility, I believe, to address those issues. So this goes to the question of unconventional versus conventional advice. And what I want to show you very briefly in half an hour or so is that my personality is I don't like to see the perpetuation of things that are wrong and are harmful. Even if they are conventional, and however much it might cost me to take them on, I'm going to do it. It's my nature. I can't help it. And I'm just going to show you very briefly, because there are one or two of them are really important examples of where I took on conventional ideas which helped the nation and in fact helped the world in the long term. And when I started, there were people who were very antagonistic to what I did. So very briefly, my career begins in 1976, and the first question I addressed were, are marathon runners immune from heart disease? And the idea at the time was developed by a Californian pathologist that if you ran a marathon, you would never have a heart attack. And I thought that was improbable, and very quickly we were able to show that this wasn't the case. It took us 4 years. We were able to find marathon runners who died during exercise and they had coronary artery disease. And so this particular slide just shows the man who, our apex case was an athlete who died during a race in Johannesburg. We were able to show he had a heart attack because we measured chemicals in the muscle of his heart and showed that he'd had a heart attack, and we showed that he had coronary artery disease, extensive coronary artery disease. This wasn't a world-changing finding or anything, but it did disprove a theory that was developing at the time. The next one is much more relevant because this was the question of neck injuries in rugby preventable, and begins with an anecdote. A Western Province player breaks his neck in a Currie Cup game in Bloemfontein and dies that night. And I was phoned by the newspaper and they said, ask me a few questions. And this is 1980, before I'd thought of the problems. And I said, these are the issues we need to address. And by chance, then I became involved in a number of studies and looking at, could we prevent neck injuries in rugby? And as I described in my book, it immediately took me into conflict with the second most, well, probably the most important man in South Africa at the time, Dr. Donnie Craven, who controlled rugby and probably many other things as well. But he wrote this letter, which was given to me after his death. And he wrote this letter to the head of Conradie Hospital, Dr. Retief, head of the spinal cord injury clinic at Conradie Hospital. And essentially it says here, graag sal ons wil help sover dit moontlik is, maar ek vra u groot asseblief, moet nie Dr. Noakes gebruik nie. Please don't use Dr. Noakes, want hy is klaar bevooroordeeld en die werke wat hy gedoen het vir die onderwysadministrasie was om die minste daarvan te sê onwetenskaplik. So that's the first time Noakes becomes linked to unscientific stuff. And this then prevented us for some time accessing the data at the Conradie Hospital. And eventually we were able, after Dr. Craven had died, we were able to access that information. And the reason why it was important was because all neck injuries at the time in rugby in the Western Cape and Namibia and part of the Eastern Cape were coming to the single hospital. So we had a resource where we could judge what was happening in neck injuries. So I think you can see on the top it's from the South African Rugby Board. And it's written to Dr. Craven, it's from Dr. Craven in his offices in Stellenbosch, Post Box 3101. The date is the 23rd of July 1987, and it's sent to Dr. Retief, who at the time was head of the spinal cord injury unit at Conradie Hospital, and that's in Howard Place. And it says, Dear Dr. Retief, many thanks for your letter of the 17th, and I presume that's this month or the previous month, in connection with spinal cord injuries in rugby. I appreciate that you wrote directly to me in this regard, because this is an opportunity this is a condition that we're trying to prevent. I understand it. That's, in other words, we're already acting on neck injuries, and thank you for the request of this information. Unfortunately, we don't always succeed in our attempts to prevent these injuries. So we want to do everything we can as much as possible. So we want to prevent these injuries, but I ask you one question. Please don't involve Dr. Noakes, because he's clearly biased against rugby, I assume. And the work that he did with the onderwys the teaching education department, we'd done a major study of 26 schools where we'd looked at injuries in 26 schools, was to say the least, unscientific. And he says, rather than speak to Dr. Noakes, go to Dr. Brigadier Etienne Hugo, who's their doctor in charge of South African rugby, etc. But the main point is he closed off our access to that science, to those data. And we knew those data were critically important if we wanted to study and prevent neck injuries. So eventually, in 1989, one of my honours students, we got hold of the access to the data, and they show the number of neck injuries in both adults in red, schoolboys in red and adults in black. And what you observe that up to 1975, there's a relatively 1 or 2 cases per year, and then suddenly after 1976 something happens, and the frequency of these injuries dramatically increased. So by 1989 there were 12 injuries a year, and I just want to say that each of these is an utter catastrophe for the family. It destroys the family, it destroys, the cost is huge. Looking after a person who's paralyzed. So this was the hidden cost of rugby. And we could see that there was a huge increase in schoolboy injuries. And so we set about trying to explain why was this happening and what could we do to prevent it. And with time, we were able to show that there were 6 risk factors. Now, these don't mean that they caused the conditions, but they showed where you should be concerned. Matches, senior players, which was completely contrary to what Dr. Craven had said. He said it's the couch potatoes, the kids who don't train and so on who get injuries. In fact, it's not. It's the best players get the most injuries. It's the players in the A teams and the first teams. And then we identified the phases of play. And this is crucial because you can change the laws of the game. And the laws have been changed specifically as a result of these guidelines. And then there were certain positions where at risk and the time of season. And it was clear that they occur at the start of the season and after the mid-season break, which tells us something about conditioning and preparation. That is a factor. So the importance of this is, even though we can't be certain that these factors are the direct cause of the injury, we can at least start addressing them and do something to reduce the rates of injury. So eventually we accumulate all this information in a book that Morne du Plessis and I wrote. And as I think I've indicated already, this book then became the basis for the most important intervention in South African rugby in its history, called the Boxsmart Program, where every referee, every coach of every team that is playing in South Africa have to go through a training program so that they know how to prevent these injuries and also how to treat an injury at the site of injury. And we know that if the player is well treated at the site of injury, the risk that he will become paralyzed is much reduced. And although the incidence is still too high, it has come down and the rules of the game have changed. And so we think we've made a major contribution to the prevention of neck injuries in rugby and making it a much safer game. And remember, what was Tim Noakes bandied around us as unscientific? And it's remarkable because we were the first to try to apply science to rugby in South Africa. And this is the one that probably I'll be best remember. And the title was, Does Dehydration or Overhydration Kill in Sport? And when I started in sport, we were told that dehydration is the sole reason for any problems that might occur. And then this is why anecdote is so important. On 1981, in the Comrades Marathon, a lady started the race in Durban, perfectly healthy, and she ran the race, and at 70 kilometers, her husband, who was watching her, she didn't recognize him, so he decided to take her out of the race, and which was very good advice. And he took her to the finish line, and she was seen by the doctors at the finish line, and they said, well, she's not well, she's dehydrated, we'll give her some fluid. So they gave her 2 liters of fluid intravenously. And her husband was clever enough to notice that she actually got worse. She didn't get better. So therefore, he concluded that these people didn't know what they were doing. You better go and find another hospital. So he took her from the finish to the doctors in Durban. And on the course, on the driving down here, at about halfway, she developed an epileptic seizure and went unconscious. So here's a lady who was perfectly healthy at the beginning, and 10 hours later, she's fighting for her life. She's unconscious. And he took her to the hospital in Durban, where she was treated by Dr. Pittaway, friend, University of Cape Town graduate. Unfortunately, he realized that this was something that had never been seen before, and he applied first principles. He didn't say, well, I'm not caring that you ran a marathon, I'm just applying first principles, you're unconscious. What could possibly cause you to be unconscious? So he took a chest x-ray and he noticed that this is the normal chest x-ray on the right, and you can see the lungs are nice and clear. So that is 5 days later when she's healing. And on the left, there's a whole lot of muck here. And that means that there's fluid in her lungs. And he couldn't explain why it was, but clearly she looked like she was overloaded with fluid. And he measured the blood sodium concentration and discovered that it was extremely low. Now, normally the blood sodium concentration is 140, and she's dropped it to 114. Now, we use homeostats to regulate everything as we've described. And normally we will regulate the sodium in this range as tightly as we possibly can. To get it down to 114, there's heroically something's gone wrong. Anyway, he treats her effectively, and after 4 days, her sodium back to normal, and she regains consciousness 4 days after falling unconscious. And this then becomes the first case of exercise-associated low sodium hyponatremia. Encephalopathy means swelling of the brain. And she writes to me a few days later, and when she's recovered, and she says, Dr. Noakes, what happened? And I said, I've got absolutely no idea, because it's never been described in the history of sports medicine. And so I start digging into it, and eventually we start to find answers. And so we wrote up then a paper with the first 5 cases in the world of this condition. I managed to find 5 cases in the next 2 or 3 years. And we wrote it up, and we called it water intoxication, a possible complication during endurance exercise. Now remember, at the time, the guidelines were that high dehydration causes the problem. And here we were saying it's the exact opposite. It's water intoxication. And of course, that immediately ran contrary to what everyone else was saying. And one of our colleagues in North America said, no, Dr. Noakes got it completely wrong. He's 100% wrong. It's dehydration that's causing this condition. And there are reasons why he wrote that. And one of the reasons was that he was one of the medical directors of a race that was funded by the sports drink industry. And the sports drink industry funding that particular race was forever telling the guys in the race, you've got to drink as much as possible or you'll become dehydrated. So it turned out the company that was involved was this company who were making this product. And I'll show you that it had really just come onto the market really in the 1980s, early 1980s. And its sale was dependent on the runners believing that dehydration was going to kill them. And that as long as they drank lots of fluid, lots of this particular drink, they wouldn't die. So that advert, which is published in 2002, says research shows your body needs at least 40 ounces of fluid every hour, your performance could suffer. And that's 1.2 liters per hour, which is an astonishing amount of fluid. It's not quite this container, but that's probably 2.5 liters. So it's probably half of this. So you must drink that every hour that you run. And it's ludicrous. So it's 1.2 liters. And the science of that, there is no science behind what they describe there. It's all marketing. Is that we described the condition here in 1981, the first case, in fact, the first 4 cases we described them. And this is the number of cases of this condition since then. So remember, for millions of years or hundreds of years that athletes have been athletic, they've never described this condition. And then all of a sudden it appears and it gets more and more prevalent, so that by 2009, when I stopped counting, there'd been 1,600 cases. And in fact, there are another 1,000 in the US military, which I haven't added. And then what is really disturbing are these are deaths. These are people who have died as a consequence of over-drinking during marathon or other races. It's utterly astonishing that both these conditions are completely and utterly preventable. They should never have happened. And they happened because there were dietary guidelines. The US industry starts there, and they get the buy-in of the scientists, and they produce drinking guidelines. I apologize for that slip of the tongue. They produce drinking guidelines which promote over-drinking. And the scientists who did that were funded by the industry. Their position as experts was because they were funded by the industry and they could do the research. So when the organizations want to get official guidelines, who do they go to? They go to the scientists who are funded by the industry. And so the guidelines were brought out twice, and they promoted increasing amounts of fluid ingestion. And only in 2002 did Dr. Cynthia Lechera die in the Boston Marathon, and then this became an international issue in America. And I was asked to produce alternative drinking guidelines, a single individual. They didn't go to the experts, the so-called experts. They went to one man, and he produced the alternative drinking guidelines, which have now since been accepted by the authorities overseas. So it was one man against the consensus, but the consensus was false because it was influenced by industry. So ultimately, I wrote this book. It took 30 years from the date of seeing of getting the first letter from the lady in Johannesburg. I wrote this book, and it includes all the science about what you should be drinking and all the scientific studies. And just like Nina Teichelt looked at all the science for the low-fat diet and the fact that low-fat diet there was no evidence for it, I looked at all the scientific studies of the over-drinking or drinking little or drinking lots and drew my conclusions, and showed that actually, as long as you're drinking to thirst, that's all you need to do. That's the only rule you need. So you can write one book on drinking during exercise, drink to thirst. That's all you have to say. But they had made this fake science about it. And so waterlogged has been called one of the 40 most important events or persons in the past 40 years of running. And the comment on the right is not relevant, but it is a real issue that now I've written that book, which does contain medical information. What's that linkage when you write a book to people who read it? What's the linkage? Are they patients or aren't they? Then we got involved in being funded by the industry and receiving money from the carbohydrate industry. So all of a sudden we started determining whether carbohydrates were healthy during exercise and did they allow you to run faster and better and so on. And then during that time I wrote this book, and we've been through this at length, so I'm not going to go through it, but the point was we did enormous amount of studies, some of the best that had been reported, and we measured all these things, which I'm not going to go into detail, but all I'm going to show you is look at the bias that happens when you have industry funding you. Now this slide shows what are we studying. These are carbohydrates. Glycogen is a carbohydrate in the liver. Glycogen here is a carbohydrate in the muscle. And here's more carbohydrate, and muscle releases lactate, and then that's used as energy. So if you were to look at this slide, you would ask, well, what is this person studying? And it's obvious carbohydrates. And where's the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room is that fat oxidation is tiny. See, it's got very little. And the answer is, why weren't we studying it? Because it wasn't funded by industry. So we just ignored it, pretended it didn't exist. And we were driven to study carbohydrate use during exercise. And so we completely ignored that. And in fact, as I'll show you, that there's much more energy in fats in the body. So why were we focusing exclusively on carbohydrates? Because industry was paying us to do that. So we did these very sophisticated studies where people exercised for 3 hours when they took in water or they took in carbohydrates. And we would work out where were they getting their energy from fat or from glucose or from glucose in the muscles. And we even showed that when they took in exogenous, i.e. they took in glucose by mouth, they were able to burn it. So I'm just trying to make the point that these are highly sophisticated studies because we were able to gram for gram work out how much of the energy had come from the stuff they had taken by mouth. And why were we studying that? Because industry was driving us to make sure that we knew, and we were promoting lots of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise.